Okay, welcome ladies and gentlemen. This is another podcast of the Wisdom Factory Literary Society. And today we will be talking about the Mauryan Empire and delving into, I will be going explicitly and in depth on one of their great leaders that I think is very underrepresented in the academic community. And he's a very interesting person to talk about. And his life embodies the central goal that we believe in here at the Wisdom Factory, and that is wisdom and virtue. And today you're going to get both of those things. Rarely do we have a podcast where both of these can be so thoroughly talked about, understood, and practical tips could be put out there for people to follow those two things, acquire wisdom and cultivate their virtue. But first I want to give you guys a preview of what I mean. And to do that, I'm going to recite a quote here by Ashoka, which we will explain who he was and what he did and why he's relevant here. And that is, he said, "No society can prosper if it aims at making things easier. Instead, it should aim at making people stronger." I believe that. Nick believes that. We hope you believe that. And that will be our attempt today to make you stronger through the understanding of this period in history and by understanding the life of Ashoka and understanding history and how empires rise and fall and how great men can change from a tyrant to a philosopher king. And first we got to get context about this whole period, the Mauryan Empire period. So Nick is going to do that. And Nick, where do we start here? Where does the story start?
Well, we're going to probably go with one of the most famous historical figures of all time, Alexander the Great of Macedonia. Now, everyone knows about the famous campaign of the great conqueror of Macedon, goes into Persia,
right,
wipes the floor with them, and then starts reaching the Indus River Valley, the beginnings of India. And he invades India in 326 BCE, although that is a little questioned at times. But anyway, he was halted at the Battle of Hydaspes by the king of that area of the Bias River, known as King Porus, or King Puru, depending on who you ask. And this was a very pitched battle, and it cost many lives. You could say, in some respects, it was a, how do I put this, a Pyrrhic victory in a sense. It cost a lot of manpower, and it drained I would say the willpower and the morale of the troops. So he won the battle. He defeated King Porus, but he did it at a great cost. Lost a lot of men, a lot of great men, and it's really debated. It's really debated even to now. Many scholars will say that they're very unsure whether it is a victory, a Pyrrhic victory, or it was just straight up inconclusive. That's the typical argument that they'll go with. It was very much a inconclusive one.
Well, real quick, Nick, why do you think it was a Pyrrhic victory? What were because Alexander is usually known for winning at any odds and doing so in a conclusive manner. Why was this one so difficult for him to overcome?
Well then, from what I can read, according to Plutarch, in the Parallel Lives, the life of Alexander, he writes it as follows.
Plutarch.
As for the Macedonians, however, their struggle against Porus blunted their courage and stayed their further advance into India. For having had all they could do to repulse an enemy who only mustered around 20,000 infantry, 2,000 horse, they violently opposed Alexander when he insisted on crossing the river Ganges. For they were told that the kings of the Gandharites and the Praesi were awaiting them with 80,000 horsemen, 200,000 footmen, 8,000 chariots, and 6,000 fighting war elephants. And there was no boasting in these reports. For Androcotus, who reigned there not long afterwards, made a present to Seleucus of 500 elephants, and with an army of 600,000 men overran and subdued India. Plutarch, Parallel Lives, Life of Alexander. Now, what he refers to here is that the mention of the 200,000+ footmen, he's referring to the Nandan Empire, which existed at that same time. So for the troops, for them to hear about a militarily advanced society that could produce easily 3 times the size of their own force. Because what they mentioned here is, how can a small principality-like state be able to produce an army that is almost to the same size as Alexander's and be able to fight with the same tenacity as them? And if you were to go and research some of this in terms of King Porus with Alexander at the Battle of Hydaspes, you'll find references that say that the king was actually a very good ruler in many respects. It was one of his kingdoms was the kingdom that he ruled was considered one of the greater ones in all of India, which is very unique.
Well, we will never know. We will never know. I tend to defend Alexander because he's been faced these odds before, attacking over a river, outmanned maybe 3-1 in some cases, in some historical cases, like in Gaugamela in the first battle. So we don't know. He never fought that Indian army that you're speaking of, but we do know that his troops didn't want the fight. They didn't want the fight. It's safe to say that they mutinied. Alexander wanted to go. He was trying to get his army to penetrate further into India, but at the battle that you mentioned, the battle with King Porus, a lot of sources indicate that he was grievously wounded. So not only was it a Pyrrhic victory for his army, but it was a Pyrrhic victory for himself, his body, his feeling of invincibility. This was one of the battles where he was injured almost more than all the other ones. If you've seen the movie Alexander the Great, I think, in maybe the early 2000s, they do a really good job of showing this scene. And it's, these Indians are fighting with everything they've got. It's Alexander's men are not used to, like, they almost call them beast-like people. And there's these Indians, and they're just fighting in ways that the Macedonians are not used to. And Alexander goes to his tried and true technique where he tries to go attack the Indian leader, the military leader, and does so and leaves his battle lines. And because he leaves his battle lines, he's vulnerable. He gets attacked by spears, by arrows, by swords. Everyone's trying to kill him. And this is the battle where, to give you the sort of cost that he had to incur fighting the Indians in this instance, he lost his horse, his favorite horse, Bucephalus. This is the battle where various sources indicate that his horse fell. And so the psychological toll, the body count, the physical count in his body, all these things added up. And then that was just a fraction of what the Indians had in reserve. And his army rebelled. They didn't want to go. And Alexander could not convince them to continue further.
Well, I mean, you could say at the same time that from what the Macedonian army was used to, they were used to the Persian armies where, for the most part, they weren't exactly fully trained troops.
Exactly.
For the most part, they were very much conscripts, and the generals that they would face were typically ones of smaller caliber compared to Alexander. Now, it's a different story if you were to go into India and then find out that there's a monarch who has similar or almost the same capability as Alexander. Now, thinking of it like that, and also understanding that in terms of the Indian subcontinent, mind you, this isn't just one small kingdom in the Nandan Empire. There's like at least a dozen kingdoms, each one of their own respect, trying to win over each other and gain an advantage. So you're definitely facing kingdoms that are used to either fighting larger opponents or opponents that are very much well trained. So
how does Alexander's failed conquest of India translate into the birth of this great empire that we're about to speak of, the Mauryan Empire?
Well, that's a good question, because in terms of the troops, the reason why they left was, again, the mention according to Plutarch. Now, the way I saw it was that it created a snowball effect. Now, mind you, I'm not saying it in the sense that, the Indians could learn many tactics from the Greeks. I'm sure that there were, but not nearly to the same degrees, again, because they were used to all this fighting. But what this did create, on the other hand, what made it interesting was that Alexander the Great, he had to go through the Hindu Kush, through the mountain ranges in Afghanistan. And what that did was create a new set of trade networks that would continue on to the modern day. So this was part of the reason of opening a trade network between the East and the West. Now, this is where it gets a little bit fuzzy, because we're going to talk about the founder of the Mauryan Empire, Chandragupta Maurya. Now, forgive me if I mispronounce these names. I am not Indian or speak the Hindi language. Now, it says here, depending on what source you read, it was Chandragupta was around and served in disguise under the Macedonian army around the time of the Battle of Hydaspes and gained recognition by Alexander. Now, there's that story, and then there's the story of his father is a chieftain, so he's the son of a chieftain that got killed, and while his mother was pregnant with Chandragupta, Chandragupta fled, in a sense, to the capital of the Nandan Empire, which I will not pronounce its name because it's very difficult. And he served basically in a pig farm, and as he was growing up his life in that time period, a minister, a very well-known minister who will write a book that I'll mention later on, named Chanakya. And Chanakya apparently was insulted by the Nandan king for being ugly, impotent, all those type of views. Yeah, he didn't take that. He didn't like that.
No one likes that.
So he swore that he was going to destroy the Nandan Empire, specifically the king. But he didn't really have an army. He was a minister, so he knew a lot, but he couldn't do a lot.
Right.
However, he met this kid, Chandragupta Maurya, who would, according to some, said that he was playing with other kids in his village and pretended to be a king of a court. And he would do all these mock trials, these mock courts and military movements. And the minister said something along the lines of, I saw talent in him, so I'm going to train him so that he could fulfill my wish.
Real quick, Nick, was Chandragupta Maurya, was he born of an aristocratic family? Was he born lowly? Because in the Indian, the caste system is pretty much the dominant social stratification mechanism. Where was he born on that ladder? Do we have any sources?
I would say it kind of depends on the faith, because if we're talking about the idea of the caste system, that's more in common with the Hindu system, not necessarily Jainism or Buddhism that would become famous under Ashoka's reign. But Chandragupta, he's a Jainist. He follows the Jainist faith.
Was his
so
parents,
it's a little bit different.
Were his parents kings, tribal leaders? What were his parents?
Like I said, it's very mythological. There's not really any concrete views on it. It seems to be he's either a lowborn, or in the best case scenario, he was the son of a chieftain. It was either maybe potentially some type of nobleman.
We don't know.
I don't know.
The sources that you can get on this particular subject are not the best. We can only go by what we have, and a lot of those are religious, religious texts by the Buddhists, the Jainists, the Hindus,
through the Vedic writings and all that.
And they could sort of play with the facts here.
Well, mind you, it's like over 2,000 years old.
So it's kind of like anything from ancient history. They didn't have an extensive written culture, literary culture. So it's not like these are government sources where they have records of his birth and who his parents were and all of these things. But there is a consensus that the majority of what we're going to present here, such as the story of his rise and the creation of the kingdom, the truth lies somewhere in the middle of it. Either whether he was a lowborn or whether he was born of an aristocratic family.
Maybe a lower level aristocrat, maybe. Who knows?
I mean, both are possible. But the important thing here is that you said someone saw merit in this person and they wanted to train him in the arts of governance.
At least that's from what I can tell. Now, again, this is all based on conjecture or depending on what source you read.
Right.
So, and I'm sure there are even other articles or people in India that would say otherwise. And then this is all from what I can find.
Yeah.
Now, anyway, in terms of past the myths and legends of Chandragupta Maurya, what happened later on is a little half myth, half truth. Because around the time that he became of age, this is all within the same time period that Alexander the Great is invading India. This is all around the same time. And at the time that Alexander had a mutiny and had to go back, go turn around because his troops wanted to go back, 2 years afterwards, Chandragupta was not only able to take down the Nandan Empire, which was an empire that scared the hell out of the Macedonians, but was able to take back the eastern satrapies, or provinces, let's call it here in the West, the provinces of the Indus River Valley that Alexander had conquered. Now, I'm going to backtrack a little bit because I messed up here. In terms of the Nandan Empire, what Chandragupta did, he was something along the lines of asymmetrical warfare or guerrilla tactics, led with advising of Chanakya or Chanakya. And originally, he tried going for the capital, which, according to what I read, it didn't really work.
Yeah.
And then there's this little lore, this little myth that said that after this campaign, as he was returning from that campaign, he saw a mother and child, and the child tried to go and eat the center of the meal. And his mother, the child's mother, stopped him and said, don't act like Chandragupta by going for the core and skipping the frontier, the outer edges. You need to go for the outer edges first before you can enjoy the finish of the core.
Right.
Chandragupta took that to heart and decided to follow the same tactic. He went for the frontier regions because partially they weren't as well defended, they were more likely to get attacked, so it was easier to conquer. And then from there, started creeping its way into the capital, and then finally executing the king.
Ooh.
And from there, usurped the throne, took over the Nandans, and then took out the rest of the kingdoms all the way to the eastern portions of the Macedonians.
So he continued to conquer ruler after ruler, all of the leaders of the different sections
because
of India.
Thanks to this guerrilla campaign, what's interesting about guerrilla campaigns is that it's much easier for you to gain alliances, especially from the frontier areas, the fringes, or the downtrodden. So what's interesting here is that, like I said before, the Nandans were able to field hundreds of thousands of troops.
Yeah.
Very well trained, very well armed. You know what Chandragupta was able to do? He was able to do something similar, except produce something at least twice the size.
Yeah.
And included the Macedonians in this too. So he definitely had experience.
So let me ask you this, Nick. So at this point in the story, you've got somebody who is meritocratic. This is somebody who's basically in this position based off his own intelligence, his own competence. Why? I mean, to me, it's obvious that at this point, there's 30 million people in India, and so that there's a lot of resources to be gained there in terms of taxes. And so from what I've understood is that in India, at this time, it was common that you conquer a land so that you could increase your tax base and you could increase your military, which would then allow you to conquer the next land, and then you can do the same thing over and over. But what was another reason? Why did he want to conquer all of this land? Was there anything about unifying India? Was there anything about spreading culture? Or was it just simply about geopolitical dominance in this region?
I would put it along the lines of, originally it was because of the minister's hatred towards the Nandan king. And he realized, both the minister and Chandragupta realized, you know what, it's probably better if we were to get rid of them, it would just cause a power vacuum.
Yeah.
And in terms of greatness, why not just do something similar and prevent outside foreign intervention, for instance, the Macedonians from ever having that happen again, and they won't have to have the chaos of what was happening previously, where you had just a bunch of small principalities trying to one-up each other.
Exactly. Yeah.
So there is that perspective. It wasn't necessarily uniting the kingdom per se, because there wasn't really a sense of unity, really. So it was more of one of those evolving type of things. You got one dream taken care of, and they thought, okay, we're probably going to have to do something else from here. And so later on here, after the Nandan Empire was taken down and Chandragupta started taking the satrapies, it was in 305 BC that Seleucid, of the Seleucid Empire, one of the 4 generals of Alexander's. When Alexander passed away, his kingdom, his empire, split into 4. The most famous one that we're going to be talking about is the one that had the largest empire, which is very reminiscent of the Persian Empire. Right. So he ruled everywhere from Baghdad and Babylon all the way to places like Lahore in modern-day Pakistan. So he tried to retake the eastern satrapies, but he failed in that conquest, Chandragupta was able to overpower him. And in order to prevent further humiliation and also to not get invaded from the other generals, Seleucus decided to make a deal. He gave Kabul, Kandahar, Baluchistan, and gave them to the Mauryan Emperor. In exchange, you would have this marital alliance so that there wouldn't be any conflict between the two. So Chandragupta was not only able to get a Seleucid wife, a Greek princess basically, but he was able to gain an alliance with a very powerful nation, and in exchange, he gave 500 of his prized war elephants to Seleucus I, which Seleucus was able to use in a very important battle at the Battle of Issus in 331 BCE. So, but that's a little bit more of a fun fact type of thing. So, what also made interesting in terms of Chandragupta, and the reason why his army was so good compared to the other kingdoms, was that it was paid by the state. It was very much a professional military.
Okay, standing army type thing.
Very much a standing army, like I said before, paid directly from the state. And Chandragupta and his advisor, Chanakya, passed a series of administrative and economic reforms throughout the empire. Now, Chandragupta applied a form of statecraft that Chanakya was able to write, which is called the Arthashastra. I'm sorry, please forgive me for this. The Arthashastra. And this is a text which, in the West, are the closest equivalent to this in the West would be Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince, which would show up in the 16th century. Now, in the West, we don't really know much about this Arthashastra, but this book was set as a form where what an empire would be like, how a monarch should rule, basically how a government should survive and with a society. So
it was a very early attempt at political science, which is something that a lot of historians will credit, Machiavelli as sort of the first one to look at the practical side of how to govern, how to obtain power. But no, and this is something that I didn't know before we started doing this research. I don't know if you knew this, but that's why it's important to increase your knowledge of different countries and different nationalities and different empires in history, because no, Machiavelli wasn't the first one. That credit, at least up until now, should go towards this guy. What was his name?
Chanakya.
Chanakya, who was actually did a Machiavelli type political science book, a manual for leaders, if you will.
Right, or at least this is what
1,200 years before Machiavelli.
Right, or at least this is what some scholars say. Some say it's similar to the Art of War, where it took an amount of time for it to develop. So parts of it was redacted, some part was enhanced.
Real quick, do we have anything about what he was trying to put out there? Like, what were the central ideas of this political philosophy thing?
Yes, however, I want to at least explain a little bit of why this book is not that famous, unless you're from India.
Right.
And it's that apparently during in the mid-12th century, it was the book was lost. So it wasn't until about 1904 to 1905 that it was rediscovered by an Indian scholar, and it wasn't put into English translation until 1909. So that's a little more than 110 years ago. So it's relatively interesting that it was brought back basically from the grave.
Yep.
So anyway, you were asking me exactly how this empire was structured and how the book detailed it.
Yeah. What's in the book, basically?
Well,
that we know.
Okay. Well, like I said before, Chandragupta applied a bunch of this into his statecraft. So it was organized into territories. The Janapada, the centers of regional power, were protected with fortifications, Durga, and the state operations were funded with the treasury, the Kosa. Infrastructure, irrigation, temples, mines, and road networks were what was the main aspects of how to start up and contain a society, or to make it prosperous. And then the regional prosperity, this is where it gets interesting. regional prosperity was one of the required duties of the state officials. So basically, for a governor to be a governor, they need to make sure that the regional prosperity of that territory is maintained or even amplified. So that's what would make a good governor.
Wow.
So now, mind you, irrigation was enhanced by Ashoka when he took power, and this system remained for at least 400 years until it was renovated.
So you could almost characterize it as a political platform. This is a political platform where we're going to focus on infrastructure. We're going to focus on certain aspects of governance. To me, that's what it kind of seems like. Like you likened it to a progressivism. Has aspects of it echoes progressivism, where you're focusing on internal development a lot.
You could say progressivism, or you could say just in general capitalism, or even state capitalism, or you could even say socialism, depending on who you ask. Because if you were to go by the Stalinist point of view, well then, he built up the nation from an agricultural society to a superpower, but at the cost of millions of lives. So it really depends on how you interpret it. Now, back onto Ashoka and the Arthashastra. It was highly considered that the economic prosperity of any region or the nation as a whole was essential to the pursuit of the Dharma, the morality, which adopted a policy of avoiding war with diplomacy, yet continuously preparing the army for war to defend its interests and other ideas within the book. So that's where I would say it's very similar to the Prince, saying how to defend the nation, how to pursue your interests, and also prevent the nation from either being attacked both internally or from foreign aggression. Now, let's see, I already mentioned about some of these details. Okay, it also details how the nature of government, the law, civil and military. I'm sorry, there's a bee on my arm.
There's a bee on Nick's arm, y'all.
Anyway,
can I kill it? Can I kill it? Oh, no, it's coming for me.
But anyway, the law, civil and criminal.
Get away. I will kill you, bee. I don't want to. All right, bee's dead.
Sadly, we can't have honey on that one. But anyway, the Arthashastra, or Sutra, it details the nature of government, law, civil and criminal court systems, ethics, economics, markets and trade, duties and the obligations of the king or the ruler.
Okay.
And it incorporates a lot of Hindu philosophy, including ancient economic and cultural details in terms of agriculture, mineralogy, mining, medicine, animal husbandry, forests and wildlife. So this is where it brings in the argument that this is a text that has been constantly built upon over the centuries. And it also, this is also what I find interesting. It explores the issue of social welfare. And this is where the progressivism comes in. That the collective ethics that hold the society together, it advises the king/ruler, excuse me, to initiate public projects such as the irrigation waterways, building forts around major strategic holdings in towns, while also exempting taxes of those affected. So if you want to look for a modern day comparison, I would say probably FDR's New Deal. I would say it's very similar to that in order to keep the nation going, or at least revitalize the economy. Now, earlier I mentioned what the Dharma is, according to the Arthashastra. And I have a sutra here by Chandragupta, and it goes like this. The root of happiness is Dharma, ethics, righteousness. The root of Dharma is Artha, economy and polity. The root of Artha is right governance, is victorious inner restraint. The root of victorious restraint is humility. The root of humility is the serving the aged. Serving the aged. So that is how Chandragupta described it, or how the kingdom was described. And if you had to look for a really close comparison of what this sutra displays, it would be Ashoka.
Okay. Well, real quick, Nick, before we get into Ashoka, which I'm more than ready to do, how do we get from, because there's a step that needs to be connected in Bindusara?
Oh, Bindusara.
So how does Chandragupta, how does his reign then transfer onto Bindusara, and then his transfers into Ashoka? What do we know about that period in between before we start going there?
Well, other than military conquests,
so they continue to conquer militarily.
They continued to conquer either because of people deciding to declare war on them, outside influence, or strictly for strategic purposes.
Okay.
There's not, oddly enough, there's not as much information when it comes to Bindusara. However, it does say that he was an exceptional ruler.
Yeah.
He's one of the three Mauryas, the first three kings, the first great kings.
Yeah.
What makes Bindusara exceptional was, one, because of leadership, but also that he also did improvements throughout the realm, especially in the conquered territories. So
he's kind of more of the same. He was maintaining and further developing the empire that his father had built.
If anything, he was solidifying the kingdom. He was solidifying it from what Chandragupta did, because what I mentioned before, Chandragupta, he seems to be one of those characters that he had the talent, but he did not have the knowledge of how to implement it. That's why he had the minister. And Bindusara is of a similar caliber, and he was being taught a lot of what Chanakya, the minister, was able to teach to Bindusara. Unfortunately, Bindusara would pass away.
Yeah. So I think that's where I can take it over, the transition from Bindusara into Ashoka, because one of the things that we know about Bindusara is that he was getting busy. A lot of wives, a lot of children, and Ashoka was not the first. Ashoka was actually, his mother was a low-born woman. Yes, his father was the king, Bindusara, but his mother was low-born. So when it comes to the pecking order, the line of succession, Ashoka was nowhere near the top. And this would come into play throughout the first portion of his life here. So Ashoka to me is one of the great characters, more colorful characters in this history period. There's a lot more sources that talk about his life, and that's why this portion is probably going to be a little bit more detailed. It still has that sort of convoluted nature where you have Hindu sources, you got Jain sources, you got what did I miss? Buddhist sources. You still got his sources, which are the best sources because he wrote these edicts, which give you some insight into who he was and his transformation and his reign. But you still have a lot of resources to pick and choose from, and I'm going to be throwing a lot of these out there. So we do know that he was born in Taxila, which was a philosophical center. This was a place where ideas were readily talked about. I mean, this period in India is one of the most academically fertile environments that you could be born in this type of time period. I mean, you had a lot of religious ideas, Jainist ideas clashing with early Buddhist ideas, clashing with Hinduistic ideas, tribal ideas, and it was the one of the things that the Mauryan Empire did really well in was cultivating an environment of tolerance to where these ideas could be debated, these ideas could be talked about. As long as no one was outright challenging the empire, these things, you were actually encouraged to learn how to articulate yourself and study these different philosophies and get into academic debates. And that was basically a place where Ashoka grew up. And the sources say that he was very good in two key skills which would play into what he was going to become. I mean, if you're going to be a king and a ruler, at this period in time, you had to be sufficient in these two skills, weaponry and academics. You had to show that, look, you knew how to handle yourself on the battlefield, you knew how to lead men, you knew how to strategize, you knew how to win, you knew how to conquer, you knew how to defend. Those were the primary things that a leader would have to do. And he showed proficiency in there. He was excellent in there to a point where his brothers began to notice that, hey, we got to be careful because Ashoka is a little bit too good in his campaigns. He's always speaking up. He's always got these ideas about how to conquer, and we need to watch him. But not only that, because his brothers had some of that. You had to have some of that. If you're going to be a ruler, you had to have some of that. You were very well taught in that. But his intelligence was something that separated him from the pack. It's what gave him his natural dignity. He was known to be very good at perceiving, at being objective on things, of interpreting things in ways that other people weren't interpreting. He was just a very bright and brilliant guy. And these two things sort of got him the notice of the ministers, which plays a very important role in this period because, like Nick has told you before, the ministers played a heavy role in the administration of this empire because you had the emperor obviously calling the shots, but he would decide what needs to be done or take advice from the ministers, and obviously he had the final say. Obviously he was the most powerful voice in the room, but he did delegate a lot of responsibility to these ministers.
I'm sorry, you're referring to Ashoka, right?
No. I'm referring to how you talked about Chandragupta.
Yeah, you're right.
How he was more focused on the bare bones conquering and stuff like that.
Yeah, because if we had to put it in any respect, because Chandragupta, he was I forgot to mention this, that he was a kind of a traveling scholar in a sense.
Yeah.
So he walked around, he would learn things or apply them to his life. And Chandragupta, unfortunately, there's no detailed accounts to his childhood, so
more of the
he was more of a student.
He seems more of the Philip, whereas Ashoka's more of the Alexander.
Yes, very much so, and I would very much agree with you on that.
Okay, yeah. So Alexander united both. He was just as a military warrior as Philip was, but he also had this intelligence, this competence. And so what that brings us to is he was growing up and the ministers liked him. And his brothers were very autocratic. His brothers that were next in line for the throne were very autocratic. And it's interesting because you have Bundasara, who's the father, who knows, he's torn. When you read the story, to me, it seems like he's torn. Because in the beginning, he sends Ashoka to govern a province that is crucial to the empire. I'm not sure what the name is, but it was in central India, and this location was important because it was an administrative hub.
May I?
It was a very, what are you trying to...
May I see it?
Oh.
Because I might be able to know what you're talking about.
I don't really have the...
Okay.
Maybe it'll probably come up later. But the point is that it's an administrative center that's in central India that has access to the sea. So it's a financial center. It's also a populous center to where you need administrative competence. I mean, it's really a big job. And Ashoka shines through. He demonstrates that, look, not only was he proficient in weaponry and academics, but that he was a great administrator, and that he was a great statesman. And at this point, his skills in weaponry had evolved to now he was a great general. So now you have someone who's actually doing who's conducting military campaigns and defending and consolidating his administrative area, and he's also administering his province in a very good way, and in to where other provinces took notice of Ashoka for this. They were like, this person is someone that we need to pay attention of. He's actually bringing peace and harmony and prosperity, but he's still bringing the sword as well. And so what happens is his brothers see this, and his father sees this, and then that's where the conflict begins. Because his father is like, you could imagine if you were a father and your son's doing this, you must be quite proud. Look at this guy. He's a great general. He's a great administrative person. This is somebody who can carry my empire on to the next level. But he's also caught in between, I guess, this tradition, this status quo that, his brothers have more legitimate claims to the throne. They're born before him. Their mothers are more higher status. And so his brothers start to convince the father to put Ashoka in left field, as it were, to put him on they send him to go on a military expedition to where there's these rebels in the eastern part of India. It's not quite Kalinga yet, but it's in that area, the eastern part of India, and they don't really give him the type of military resources that he would need. And so to me, it reminds me of how Rome was like, okay, Caesar, you can go ahead and fight Vercingetorix at the Siege of Alesia, but we're not going to give you any more troops. We're not going to give you any more resources. You got to win on your own.
Good luck.
It's all, good luck, and we secretly want you to lose. You know what I mean? To me, that's what there's parallels here. So they sent Ashoka on this fool's errand. There's no way he can win. This is a very populous area. It's a rebel part that they've been having trouble with, and he goes there, and they embrace him. They don't even fight him. They choose to lay down their weapons because they're like, oh, Ashoka is going to govern our region? His reputation preceded him as someone who was very super confident and someone who they can deal with. They saw him as reasonable. They felt like they could deal with Ashoka. And so there was really no great conflict. And so once he did that, they were like, okay, well now what are we going to do? That didn't work. So they actually sent him to Kalinga, which is there's the storms of war are starting to brew around this area of Kalinga, which is an eastern part of India. It's kind of next to the coast, and this is a section that the empire does not own. And from what I've gathered is that the previous two emperors have actually tried to conquer this territory, and both of them have failed. So they know that, look, this is just this is a place that it's very difficult to conquer. So they sent Ashoka there, but the rebels, they don't embrace him. Obviously they want to kill Ashoka. They want to kill anybody who's part of the Mauryan Empire. But things get out of hand, and it's too much for him. And his father actually feels like, you know what, I need to call Ashoka back. Things are getting too bad over there. And they call him back. But when they call him back, he ends up dying. Bindusara ends up dying. And so what happens is you have a struggle between his rulers, his firstborn legitimate sons that are going to make a claim for the throne, and then Ashoka, who at this point has demonstrated his merit and who has the support of the ministers. And the ministers support him for two reasons. The first reason is for what we've talked about. He's a great general. He's a reasonable person. He's not afraid to fight, and he's also very competent. He's very smart. He's very academic. He understands things that the brothers just don't. He's bright, whereas his brothers seem a little bit more dull, more militaristic. But this is the end all be all. His brothers are autocratic, so they don't even consult the ministers at the level of what the previous two emperors have. They sort of try to push the ministers out because they see the ministers as encroaching upon their natural power. And so the ministers go to support Ashoka. And what happens here is where we really get a peek into how ugly Ashoka, I don't know if ugly is the word, but how dark he could be and how dark he was at this point in his time. Because he was able to outmaneuver his brother and outmaneuver all of his brothers. And he was able to defeat them in battle. And he killed, remember how I talked about how, one thing about Bindusara we know is that he was getting busy. He had apparently hundreds of kids because you got a harem, you're sleeping with, a bunch of women a lot, and you have, a lot of kids. He killed, from one source that I've got, 99 of his brothers. 99 of them. I mean, yes. That is brutal. Yeah. And not only did he kill them, but he was known to have this, they called it Ashoka's paradise. And what Ashoka's paradise was a torture facility. And he was so sadistic that he made sure that the outside looked as beautiful as it could possibly be. Kind of like this, this scene right here. We got the, fountain, we've got the trees, we got the leaves. This is an academic place, you get a good vibe from here. But Ashoka made sure that the outside looked beautiful, immaculate, gardens, fruits, everything you wanted. But inside, the most terrible things that you could possibly do to a human being, he was doing. It was said that no one that went in who was to be tortured ever came out. I don't know if that means they, God. Yeah, exactly. So it was psychological torture. And this is where, he needed to do this because he defeated his brother and all the people who sympathized with his brother. He tortured them in this kind of way. And,
I think I know the places that you were talking about, the province that he had to be in. I think I know what state that is in. And then also you were asking where the state of Kalinga was.
Yeah.
Well, first off, from what I know, the governorship that he had to go over on the west coast, that's most likely Gujarat.
Okay. Yeah.
Because in the past, that used to be a very important trading area in India, and that was one of the few areas that was under Chandragupta's reign and Bindusara. Now, in terms of Kalinga, that's in the modern state of Odisha, which in the past, to Europeans, it was called Orissa, which was in the on the east coast, just south of Bengal.
Okay.
Now, anyway, in terms of...
so what do you think about Ashoka doing this type of torture to his brothers, to the sympathizers? I mean, this is pretty dark stuff, ain't it, Nick?
You want my take on it? I would say, how do I put this? Yeah, it was very much sadistic. Yeah. I'm not going to lie, that was very much horrible.
It's a little bit over the line, isn't it?
I would say it is over the line, especially by the fact that you build a palace, but on the inside, it's basically a dungeon of torture.
Exactly.
However, in terms of killing off the children, I mean, this isn't the killing off the siblings. It's not the first time that has happened. Actually, a good example of this would be the Ottoman Empire in the early first few centuries of its existence. They would have this, fratricide. Fratricide? Or basically the killing of their own siblings or children to make sure that they would never become opposition.
The reason why I ask you, Nick, is because with Ashoka, it's important to, and sources have been trying to do this ever since, to really illustrate how evil he was at this point in his life, how dark he was, how, in Western society, how the most you as close as you can get to the devil, that's pretty much. To me, if you're doing this, you're right. You're a stone's throw away from that.
Right. You would be calling him a tyrant.
Yeah, a tyrant. But not only a tyrant, because a tyrant does bad things, but he's getting enjoyment. He's trying to inflict suffering that's on a whole other level.
A Caligula type.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect. A Caligula type kind of character that we have right here. And that's important because now he's done all that. He's consolidated his power. And, now everyone is behind him, and he has inherited this great empire that Nick has just built up. Nick and the help of the two emperors have built up for you guys. He inherits this empire, and his first thought is that, look, I need to go conquer some other areas because, obviously that increases your tax base. But it seems like to me that he did this for two reasons. He chose Caligula, which was, as I said, a place where he had to retreat early, where his father had called him back before because it just seemed like, he was in danger. His life was in danger. And so he wanted to conquer this place. And, obviously he wanted to conquer it for the reasons that all emperors want to conquer anything, and that is because of resources. You want to plunder. You want to take their gold. You want to take everything that they have. You want to make it your own, and you want to use those resources to support your state, as well as knocking out a potential enemy.
Right. If I recall, Kalinga was a big trading country, wasn't it?
Oh yeah. Trading. Yeah. Good point, Nick. So let's talk about Kalinga a little bit because I find Kalinga a very interesting place at this time. And so Kalinga is, I would sort of liken it to Athens, but it's an entire province. It's not a city. But this is a city where they are known for their talents and their skills. They're known for their trades. These are tradesmen. They are very. They have a large navy. They are a naval power because they're engaged in all this trade. But they're creating a lot of arts and crafts. They're very skilled people. They're not. I'm sure they've got agriculture, but they're so advanced that they've figured out a way to get beyond agriculture in some sense, as much as you could in a society where feudalism dominates everything. And so, it was a very scholarly place. It was a very cosmopolitan place. You had a bunch of people that, all the trade networks that they had, and they were able to defend themselves. So they obviously had a lot of pride. This was a force to be reckoned with, just based off their competence here, based off of their skill. And so he wanted to conquer them, not only for their resources, but because I'm sure there was a part of him that said, you know what, my father and my grandfather failed, I'm going to succeed. So that pride, played a huge part in this. And so you have greed and pride, which is pushing him to try to conquer this land. Now that's important because we want to illustrate the vices that are controlling Ashoka. Ashoka is going to have I would call it a come to Jesus moment, but obviously we're dealing with Buddhists. So with Buddhists, and there's obviously aspects of early Hinduism in here, Jainism. And so he is basically doing this because of greed and pride. And he does not realize the cost that this war is going to have. He ends up instigating a war against Kalinga. And he completely plunders this land, and he completely destroys this land. So his greed is satisfied because he plunders it and takes all the resources. His pride is satisfied because he destroys this place. But he looks around at all the carnage, and this cost 300,000 lives. 300,000 people die.
At least.
At least. That doesn't even account the 100,000 that he deported from this land. But he basically has to, these people fought to the death, and the sources say that they only lost the war because of the carnage and the attrition, and that there was no one else to fight. There was no one.
Truly total war.
Yes, it was total war, exactly. So he lost this battle because they had fought to the last man, and he had defeated the last man. And so, he looked around and saw the destruction of this former vibrant society, this great arts and culture hub, this great trading hub, and he looked around and saw nothing but smoke and ashes.
The fatherless families.
Yes, the fatherless families, the orphans, the old people, and it was hell on earth. And to give you guys a little bit of a picture in your head, think of modern day Syria. Think of modern day Syria, how that kind of is, right? Everything is exploded, you've got children everywhere, no one knows, there's orphans, and it's just hell on earth. And he created this, and he was like, why did I create this? He had to do some soul searching. And he was looking around, and the sources say that he was converted by Buddhist monks, but I'm sure that Ashoka had to come to terms with what he's done and what he's seeing and figure out why did this happen, and the answer lied within him. The answer was within him. And so during this personal exploration, because Ashoka was very smart, he was very brilliant, it wasn't something that he was going to just put behind him. He went to the Buddhist monks, and he learned more about Buddhism, and he learned more about Buddhist practices and sort of the Dharma that you're talking about, and it completely changed him, a change of heart. He decided from this point on forward, he was not going to be someone who waged war for conquest. He was still very adamant that, look, if you're he kept the standing army. He still understood that you have to defend what you have. But the period of expansion had pretty much ended with Ashoka realizing that, this just isn't the way to govern an empire.
Right. I guess the best way would you put it something along the lines of, after that moment in Kalinga, after that victory, he had become a stern father figure at that point.
I think it's a very fair, a stern father, because a stern father is, if you mess up, he's going to keep you in line. But he's not a tyrant father.
Yeah,
he's not a tyrant father.
He's not a tyrant.
He's going to be arbitrarily trying to find faults in what you're doing, even if you're not doing anything wrong.
But he will definitely try to direct you in the right way so that you don't make the mistakes of what the father made.
I think that's a perfect analogy, because the stern father keeps the discipline. And that's kind of what Ashoka then began to do. And he did, and then he became the ideal ruler. Someone who we just talked about had his paradise prisons, and who just killed 300,000 people. Just to give you a little bit of context, Nick, at this time in India, there was 30 million people. He killed 300,000 of them. That's, by my math, 0.02%, which if you converted it to America, that would be...
Wait a minute. You said 30 million? And only
30 million,
300,000.
Yeah.
That's 1%.
Yeah. 30 million, and I think it's 0.01%. 0.01%. Yeah. And so if you put that in America today, that's 3 million. So that's like if there was a war in America and we lost 3 million people. We've never lost 3 million people in a war.
Not really.
That is a World War II scale type conflict. And remember, at this time, there is no machine guns that can take out 20 people in 5 seconds.
Yeah, this is all spears, arrows, shields,
there's
and elephants.
There's no artillery that's going to take out 50 guys at one time. There's no plane bombs that are going to dive in and take out entire platoons. No, this is hand-to-hand combat, arrows. This is face-to-face type carnage, fires, everything,
Elephants.
the whole night, and 3 elephants, 3 million deaths is what it would be in today. So, I mean, try to imagine that in your head, that type of carnage. And so that's what transformed him into this ruler. And just to explain a little bit, because now it gets into the area where it's more in line of what we believe here at the Wisdom Factory, you know, the cultivation of virtue. And he becomes a paragon for virtue and someone who we can all learn from. So he goes on these spiritual journeys. He becomes like a monk. And you can imagine this guy's an emperor, right? He just consolidated his empire. He expanded the borders of his empire, but now he's sort of trying to go on this spiritual journey and learn a little bit more about the wisdom that these Buddhists and that these other monks and shaman type people have to offer. And he comes to the realization that Dharma is the most important thing in life. Dharma is how everyone should behave. And what Dharma is it's not Dharma is a behavior. So it's how you act, how you interact with the world, how you do things that is in accordance with the highest ideals of duty, order, virtue, and law. So obviously they believe in a natural law. It's kind of like an Aristotle thing, how a flower's purpose is to blossom, or a river's purpose is to flow whatever way it's flowing, doing what it was designed to do. He believed that humans were designed to follow this natural order, and that natural order dictated that they become righteous, that they, do the right thing at the right time, to the right people for the right reasons. And so, in order to do that, you needed moral purification. You really had to understand, what you were doing, and you could not fall into the opposite, which was the vice. And so, in these traditions in India right now, they give you a little bit of context to what that means, and you could, I think this is a Hinduistic interpretation, but Dharma has connotations in Hinduism as well as Buddhism. It's a word that's used in Indian society. It means a lot of things. Dharma means a lot of things. But at the end of the day, they all have the same spirit. And so that's why you can look at the explanation, and it'll match up with the Buddhist explanation. And so it's like contrasting violence and healing. So instead of inflicting pain and suffering on people, you're trying to help them to ease their suffering or to heal them from their infirmities and their pain. You're trying to heal them instead of hurt them. And this was interesting. This is what I thought was interesting, because I haven't noticed this explicitly stated in other forms of moral ethic teaching, and that is falsehood and calumny versus truthfulness and fact. So to be righteous, you have to tell the truth, and you have to use facts. You can't deceive, you can't lie, you can't use falsehoods, you can't attack people's character. You've got to represent reality as it truly is. Another thing was that, and this is another interesting thing, is that to be truly dharmatic, to be in accordance with Dharma, you couldn't go out and just deny that morals didn't exist. That's something that they actually thought that was important. You can't go out there and say Dharma doesn't exist, virtue doesn't exist, morality doesn't exist. That in itself is a form of ad-dharma, the opposite of Dharma, the vices. You had to be faithful to them. You had to profess them. You had to believe in them. You had to have faith in them. That's another important aspect. So it's kind of like another, kind of like what Nick touched on. Then you get to the more Buddhist interpretation, which is moral righteousness, prosperity of having economic values so that you can have the resources to live the life that you need. They thought that was important. You had to go out there and figure out how to support yourself in a material world. Psychological wellness, that was also something that Ashoka was very adamant about. Is psychological. And another one was liberation of spirit. And now that's an interesting one to me. I really, really like that one. I think it's interesting. And to do that, obviously, you have to figure out, you know, like you kind of said, what your desires are and free yourself from the desires, but also having a true understanding of the world and your place in it, and understanding that you have the choices. You have the ability to choose your path forward, as long as you're not, you know, overstepping your bounds of the law, as long as you're obedient. But to liberate your spirit, educate yourself, become righteous, become strong, and you know, free yourself from whatever ignorance you were in, or whatever bondage you were in, or whatever vices you were living in. You could liberate yourself. And so, you know, basically he becomes a spiritual man, but he has to transform himself, and then once he transforms himself, he then transforms the way that he governs. And that's where it gets really interesting, because he does put up these edicts, he does start these programs which manifest the political document that you referenced earlier that was kind of like Machiavelli. He puts those into practice. And you know, back in this day, this is unprecedented. You have to understand that we're talking about ancient classical eras. And, you know, if you're a ruler, you're an emperor, you're focused on, you know, how to have the best entertainment at your dinner, how to make sure that the military is running well. You do not care about the lives of the daily pleb, the average citizen, the everyday person, the everyday Joe out there, you know, working at the cow dung factory or whatever, or the elephant dung factory. But Ashoka actually makes it a part of his administration to go out and talk to the common people and to try to help them understand that their welfare is his number one priority now. It isn't the welfare of, you know, obviously it's the empire, but he believes the best way to create a strong empire is to empower the people. And that's a fundamental shift that we don't see happening a lot in ancient rulers, is where they focus on the everyday person and making them strong. And that's one of the things that he did that was, to me, very interesting, that, you know, he focused on these people. But here's an interesting concept that Ashoka had, and this is why I would call it more progressive as opposed to libertarian, is because Ashoka believed that people need to be influenced, or people needed to be pushed to also practice moral, dharmatic behavior. It wasn't just about the ruler being the philosopher, king, ruler, type ruler. No, the people had to do their duty as well. So it wasn't just about a wise administration that was, you know, was doing all these infrastructure projects, making sure that everything was paid for, that, you know, there was no wars, defending the empire. The people themselves had to become more righteous. And he made it his mission to cultivate that among them. Now, he didn't kill people if they didn't subscribe to his beliefs. He didn't try to, you know, he wasn't tyrannical about it. He just offered his values over and over. He made sure that everyone knew his values. And that's something that we don't really, in an American context, that's not something that we believe a ruler should be doing. A ruler shouldn't tell us how we should believe or feel, or what moral values we should put as first and foremost. You know, like, to me, that doesn't seem like something that we do here in America. I see. How do you feel about that, Nick? Like, sort of having an embodiment of morals and then saying, you need to change your behavior and be more like this. Is that something that you see that American government does right now?
I would say yes in that regard. The American society does do that, because, mind you, if you go by in terms of how America operated, or rather how it was born in, or the principles that it uses, they're very specific, or they're very much inspired by them. Now, if we were to talk about whether they impose it on other people, I would say it's more like a set of guidelines that, look, we want you to follow these set of principles so that, one, you can better fit with society, and that we won't have any type of disputes that are going to harm society as a whole. So that's where I would say yes, but not to the point of basically shoving it down someone's throat.
I mean, to me, it seems institutional. It seems institutional. And what Ashoka's doing, he's calling on the people to do something. It's kind of like, ask not what your people can do for you. I mean, ask not what the government can do for you. Ask what you can do for the government. That's kind of the only time that I hear this kind of governmental philosophy being used. Because in the presidential debate, I don't hear anything about what is proper moral behavior.
Yeah.
I don't hear anything about
what's the right way of doing things.
Yes, what's the right way of doing things. It's, here's what I'm going to do, here's how it's going to benefit the country. Well, the Ashoka is saying, here's what you need to do for this country to be great.
Yeah.
And we do, I think, at an institutional level, at a cultural, traditional level, we do these things.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. In terms of a cultural sense
we do.
and legal sense, I would say for the most part, yes. Because if you start having a whole different thing coming into play, like I said before, you're going to cause disputes or miscommunication. So you need to have a set of standards. Otherwise, it's not going to work, especially for a society like the United States, where you need to have those standards. Because if you have someone, say, from another culture that follows a whole different set, that society, that
becomes corrupt.
Yeah, well, it's not just whether they can become corrupt or not, or rather, you got two different groups that have two different ways of viewing things, and it becomes a lot harder to govern when you have a multiple, what's the right word?
Multiple interpretations of what's right.
Yes, multiple interpretations that can be, what's the right word?
Seen as true.
No, confrontational with each other.
Yeah. So he did that, and he made it his number one priority to make the lives better for the people. Now, isn't that what we all want from our rulers, right? For them to be, you know what? I don't care what's going on in Afghanistan. I'm not trying to make their lives better. I want your life to be better. How can I help you? And that's that's a big thing. That's a huge thing, and that's what makes him rare. He actually made that leap. And so he did some interesting things in his administration that are worth pointing out. The first is he started one of the first recorded, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but like institutional healthcare system. Obviously back then it was down to herbs and medicine, but he made it a priority to set up institutions that would heal not only people, but cattle for some reason. He wanted to make sure that he really had a thing for all life. And so he made sure that if you were sick, you were going to be healed. If they had a cure for you, he was going to make sure that under his administration, you were going to find access to a way to heal you from whatever infirmity that you had.
There are only a few societies, roughly around the same period or before, that have done something similar. The only ones I can think of right now are pretty much the Chinese, the Egyptians, the Persians, the Persians, Achaemenid Persians, the Greeks to a lesser extent, and then near the end of the Roman era, they've had something like that, but it wasn't that common per se in the age of antiquity. It was more of the herb type. But as they conquered other societies, they adopted those pieces. This was something that I'm pretty sure that he felt was, I mean, because if you think about it, if you value the people, and there's a guy over there who's sick, he's got he's got a virus, he's got like lupus or something, and you can heal him. And what happens if you heal this guy? He no longer has to be stuck, in his room, coughing, wheezing. Or even being a burden.
Yeah, I wouldn't say burden, but just like non-productive. Non-productive. I wouldn't say cost, because that dehumanizes it, but not productive to the level that he could be. And so, for Ashoka, it's like, how can I get this guy to live a better life, be a happier person, to be more in tune with his dharma? And obviously, you have to free him from whatever sickness that he has. And I think that's how he's thinking about it. He's not thinking about it from a top-down perspective. He's not thinking about these are his toy soldiers and they got to be good so that they can serve the state. He's thinking about it from their point of view. That how can they live a better life? What can I do to enable them to live a better life? The first thing that I can do is make sure that they're not sick if they don't have to be. And so I thought that was really cool. And that type of compassion is very rare from a leader like this. And he also did some cool things, like started infrastructure projects to allow people to be able to travel throughout the country. But he also made sure that it wasn't just a functional type, I built a road and then that's it. He made sure that he planted large fruit trees all around these roads, so that if you had to travel from one place to another, you could take a rest under a tree to have shade, and then these trees had fruit so that you can sustain yourself. So he sort of really thought about how to make life better in that situation if you're traveling. which is other countries like Rome would just put a road and say, that's it, you're on your own.
Right, but I mean, at the same time, it was better to have a road than just a dirt one.
Yes, absolutely.
But I mean, I do understand where you're coming from, and that does make sense.
It's going above and beyond.
Yeah,
it's going above and beyond.
That's the difference between a working society, a good society, and a great one.
And so he also, no cost, well, maybe, I'm sure they had to pay taxes, but he created wells all throughout the empire so that people had water to drink. So he felt like if people were happy, they would be able to conform better to morality. And this is something else that he did, which I thought was an innovation. And you can, again, correct me if I'm wrong here, Nick. But he appointed officers of morality. So he had a department that had people that he personally appointed to go around and try to cultivate virtue among the people, to try to establish morality among the common people, just letting them know that, hey, this is a way that you could live, here are the benefits. And not only did he use these ministers to establish morality, but he had benefits to if you lived a moral life. If you were a person that had proved that you had integrity, you were a moral person, he would give you welfare benefits. I'm not sure if these were cash payments, if this was land, if this was favors, but there was a system where you would be rewarded if the ministers reported that you were somebody who was outstanding in your community.
Well, that's an interesting thing.
Yeah, it's quite unique.
Yeah, it is. I would say it's fairly unique. I would say if I were in their position, honestly, the best method would be tax reductions, in all honesty.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
I think that would be a pretty decent way of it, because you could go more than that, but the problem is if you do that, people could become dependent on you.
Yeah.
So the best, in my opinion, the best way of doing it would be just lower taxes.
Yeah.
If it's proven that you are someone of a higher morality, I guess you could say, more upstanding. There you go.
Yeah.
And when you were mentioning about Ashoka picking the ministers, if I remember right, in the book that we were talking about earlier, it actually makes a reference to what to see in ministers, basically the screening of them to see if they're good. So if I ever get the chance and come across that book again, I'm definitely gonna get a hold of it. So
we'll put it in the show notes. We'll make sure to put that in the show notes. If we can get that later, we'll update it, because I think that's very interesting as a politician, political science major. What this person would want to look for in a minister, because that's always
what makes a good ruler, and what kind of ministers to look for in order to be a good ruler.
You're putting someone in a position where they're telling other people this is the right behavior. So you have to make sure that these ministers have integrity. Like this minister is righteous. You got someone who's not righteous telling other people how to be righteous. It's just not going to work.
Well, yeah, but then there's also the one where picking people to support you or be a part of you, whether it's a business, whether it's the military or in politics. The thing about it as of right now, it's more of an art.
Yes.
You see, because here's an example. Well, here's the way it goes.
Yes.
Because you could pick anyone that sounds like they have a good moral standing, but the minute you give them power, everything changes. They become the exact opposite of what you thought they were going to be. And then the people that you thought were the evildoers or dressed bad and they were going to do evil things, but then when you put them in power, in some cases they end up being the best you will ever find.
It's a talent to be able to look at someone, to interview them, to be around them, and then to make the judgment on whether this person is a righteous person and is suitable to lead a position of authority where you're going to be then propagating righteousness and cultivating righteousness. That is something that I think Ashoka could do. From what I've read about Ashoka, he has that particular skill, that talent to discern people's hearts.
Yeah, the last thing you need is a minister that becomes the puppeteer that controls the ruler.
Yeah.
So basically almost a kingmaker.
That's why I think it had to be, that's why I think it made sense to be an appointment type thing, where it wasn't a a gradual, the ministers decide for themselves who could be the person, who could be in. That's why he had to be like, no, only me. I got to choose, because if I institutionalize it, institutions always become corrupt over time. And so while I'm alive, I can do this job. I mean, you might disagree, but I thought because Ashoka is such a unique person, he's so rare that he would be able to handle this type thing. And we're getting to the end here, but Ashoka was able to live for 40 years. Peacefully,
that's a pretty good reign.
Peacefully after this Kalinga battle, and he was able to live peacefully, prosperly. His empire flourished. The arts, the academics, the culture, everything you could possibly imagine was able to flourish for 40 years. And real quick, before I pass it on to no, you know what? Let's go ahead and go back to Nick. And so, what happens after Ashoka once he dies? And then, we don't have this philosopher king, virtuous leader, who was once an evil man, but...
Well, sadly, the empire starts to crumble. That's the sad part of what happens when you have a set of great rulers. One, it's kind of hard to be of equal standing to them because they were so good, but it was on a downward spiral for the next 50 years after Ashoka passing. From what I've read, they said there were several reasons as to why the empire fell apart, but predominantly it was because they did not have the leadership to it. Now, what happened when Ashoka died, one of his kids that took over, he was blind. That's going to be one issue right there. And then the other sons, one was a governor, not necessarily great in one of the provinces, and then the other one, if I remember right, was not exactly a good leader in general. So the only one that was good was the blind man.
Yeah, and that's, I mean...
Yeah, that was the first problem. Second problem was that once the blind one died, his son took over, and he wasn't that good of an administrator either.
So just incompetence, a gradual. Because people sense weakness. And it's an opportunistic thing when these tribal leaders can spark up revolts and carve away territory here and there and undermine the system here and there, and eventually these things collapse. If you don't have a ruler that can preserve that power, preserve the traditions, preserve the integrity.
This is where I find it great that the three great Mauryan rulers were able to set in road networks to better administer the empire. However, the empire was still too large.
Right.
At the height of Ashoka's reign, it was said to be somewhere around 50 to 60 million in his domain. That is unprecedented. You have almost no empire has been in that time period ever been of that size.
It's huge.
Not many could boast that kind of size. You could say maybe the Chinese were able to get that big, but again, that's very rare.
Yeah.
Now, the reason why I said that was a problem was that unless you're a great ruler, you can't be there all at once, and you need good ministers, and you need a lot of them to be around. But if you're not that good of a leader, you're not going to be that good at picking ministers, or if you did pick good ministers, those ministers will take advantage of you. And then everything starts spiraling down.
Unfortunately, you had three great leaders, and then after Ashoka, things kind of got out of hand.
It's just started.
And a gradual degradation of the empire.
And it's not just that. You also remember when you mentioned about revolts from all the previous rulers? Now remember, this is an empire that was built in one generation and was only slightly increased on the second generation, and again slightly increased under the third one. Now think of it like this. You have multiple nationalities that were just conquered into one political entity. What happens when all of those great rulers are gone? You got incompetent rulers or incompetent ministers that are not able to fulfill the desires, needs, or wants of those 60 million subjects. Those 60 million subjects are going to either revolt, or they're going to start reminiscing of the past, and they're going to want their own independence.
Autonomy back.
Or, in the case of what happened with the last monarch in 185 BCE, the generals get power hungry, because they say, oh, this is something I can take advantage of.
Exactly.
I can become the ruler of the nation, and I know what's best.
Well, Nick,
so I will get rid of the ruler.
it seems that we're running out of light. The sun seems to be setting on us because we are at Taylor Murphy's History Building, and above us there's no roof. So that's why the video might be getting a little bit darker.
You're right.
And the sun is also setting on this podcast. I think, Nick, I have a quote that I want to give by Ashoka to end it. But before we give this quote, given all that we've talked about, the history of the Mauryan Empire, this great character of Ashoka, who is really someone who's really interesting, who, if at the Wisdom Factory we value wisdom and virtue, and if you do as well, Ashoka is someone who is a case study in virtue. Mm-hmm. Because most virtuous people aren't all good. They have a history.
Like all people. All people have problems.
They have their problems. Now, Ashoka was the extreme of that. And he was also the extreme of virtue. So there's a lot to be learned here for potential leaders, for people who are just interested in morality and ethics, people who are interested in governance, people who are interested in power, people who are just interested in humans. I think at the end of the day. So I would highly recommend Ashoka as someone to look into and to sort of set up as a, what's that term? A moral exemplar? An
example?
No, it's a concept of it. I think it's like someone who lived righteously. Who didn't talk about it. They actually lived righteously. And I think he became a moral exemplar. Obviously,
someone to look up to?
Yeah, someone to look up to, someone to model as far as modeling virtuous behavior. I think he's someone who fits that mold, and Buddhists certainly used him as, the prototypical, archetypical leader of someone who's righteous and who has power and who exercises that power in accordance with Dharma. So that's what I want to say, Nick, before I leave it to you. But in terms of the Wisdom Factory and what we're trying to do here, the wisdom and virtue, and all that we talked about today, what are some final thoughts that you have to leave the people with? I mean, it could be anything.
I would say it's kind of something towards Ashoka, because we both mentioned that he was both extremes. He was both one of the best rulers that ever exists, but in the beginning, he was one of the most terrifying.
Oh, yeah.
So under the book that we kept referencing, and also to the Machiavelli, what makes a strong ruler is one that's not only loved but also feared. Because what made Ashoka very special was that even though he had this trend of going into Buddhism, or making Buddhism very much a major religion up to the modern day, people saw him as weak because of that viewpoint, and they tried to take advantage of it. However, he had to be the monarch of an empire of 60 million or so subjects. He had to be able to make the call and kill opponents when necessary. And I think that's where a lot of people seem to miss. It's that, yes, it's good to be a great leader, don't get me wrong. However, people will always see that as a weakness, and you need to be willing to make the tough calls. Sometimes you need, the best way of putting it is, sometimes you need to break some eggs in order to make an omelet.
And I love that point, Nick, because that is so important. Because we talk about wisdom and virtue, and I particularly, value virtue because that's something that is not taught anymore. That's a lost art. And no matter where you look, the Hindus have a conception of it that perfectly aligns with the conception that the Africans have with the Ubuntu tradition, to what we have in the Christian tradition, to what Aristotle had in classical philosophy. I mean, this stuff exists. Stuff exists, and it does empower you. But people have a totally wrong conception of it, that if you're going to be virtuous, you're going to be weak. And the best way that I can help you understand what we know, what we mean by virtue, is look at a hero. Look at a hero. What is a hero, right? A hero, look at Captain America.
A good person.
Or Iron Man.
A good person, but he needs to throw punches in order to save people.
A good person, but if you're an evil villain and you're trying to mess with this person or mess with innocent people, you're going to get knocked,
Yeah, you're going to be knocked out pretty quickly.
The hero is always very strong and always very competent and always willing to use that force and that strength against the enemy of righteousness. And that is where I think we'll get into Ashoka's final quote for this amazing podcast that I've had, Nick, with you. and that is, may the partisans of all doctrines in all countries unite and live in common fellowship, for all live to profess a mastery to be attained over oneself. And that mastery leads to the purity of the heart. So,
man, I kind of wish I could recite the sutra right now that I mentioned earlier, because I really like that sutra. Because again, it it's
so
things on
yeah,
humility.
look at the sutra if you guys want some more quotes like that. To me, well, what does that quote mean to you, Nick? So to me, okay, so may the partisans of all doctrines in all countries unite and live in common fellowship, for all alive profess mastery to be attained over oneself, and purity of the heart. So that's just like, it doesn't matter what religion you are. It doesn't matter what moral philosophy you have. It doesn't matter what sect you're a part of. Everyone understands that you have to master yourself. You have to master your emotions. You have to master your decision making. You have to master making the choices that are going to bring you closer to living your purpose in life. And a huge part of that is, you need to find a purity of heart that only comes with living virtuously and righteously. Right. And I don't think anyone's going to have a perfectly pure heart ever.
We all wish.
Yeah, but you have people who are on the spectrum of a wicked heart and a more pure heart. Is there anything else that you can derive from this Ashoka quote, Nick? Or that pretty much?
I would say not necessarily that quote, but that quote definitely fits with the sutra that I mentioned earlier, and that in order to be, how to achieve happiness or to be a good ruler, you need to have inner restraint, a very victorious one at that. And then in order to have that great inner restraint, you have to have good humility, and in order to have good humility, something along the lines of you need to have a good heart, you need to be one of stable mind, all of these different things, and not be weak-minded or weak-willed. You need to have a strong will in order to achieve some of the goals that you have in store, whether it's the tangible, intangible, the physical, the non-physical, the mental, or the ones that you touch, see, or hear. You need to be able to make those kind of decisions, even though that you may know that it's the best decision and everyone else knows it, people still not want that. Either because it changes everything about their lives, or it threatens their benefits.
Hear, hear. Well said, Nick. Well said. Well, it was our pleasure to bring to you guys the information of the Mauryan Empire. It was a pleasure to do the research. It was a pleasure to talk about Ashoka. And Nick, it was awesome to listen to you explain the Mauryan Empire and help me get an understanding of it. So thank you for being here. Thank you guys for tuning in. Subscribe below, and that is it. Golly.
Okay. Let me see if I can get the mic out. Where are you? But golly, why did that bee have to get in the way?
Right, you must die.
Twice, I kid you not. And then I saw a rat in the corner. Did you not see those rats?
Oh, I didn't see any rats.
I saw like 2 of them. One good size, as big as my palm.
There was rats here?